Here at Analytics, we help institutions support their strategic decisions by bringing together their data into scenarios, allowing them to better understand the past to inform and plan for the future. I'm Kim Fisher, Director of the Higher Education Practice at Analytics, and I'm going to do my best to summarize the deep background of my guest today. Russ Sherman is CFO at Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky. He spent most of his career prior to Spalding in healthcare. One of my favorite things he says about his time in healthcare is, when you spend time walking the halls of hospitals, you learn the difference between a good day and a challenging day. His career has always been a balance of technology and finance, and because of that, I can trust his assessment of technology to meet the needs of finance. He completed his MBA on campus where his dad was on faculty, and that's where he started to learn how higher ed works and doesn't work. He would go on to work at Humana, a health insurer, where he would do activity-based costing, which was really looking at how resources were consumed and applying that to the services industry, which was revolutionary at the time. It taught him a profound lesson. He can naturally instill change in the planning process. The planning process should be a living, breathing, ongoing conversation. And Rush would say, where the budget goes, the actuals will follow. Fast forward to today, Rush has been at Spalding for 6 years. He has a strong partnership with his president, Tori Murden McClure, the first woman to row solo across the Atlantic Ocean, detailed in a book called The Pearl in the Storm, and she pledges that every student will leave Spalding a stronger leader, a more involved citizen, and an enlightened lifelong learner. We pick up our conversation with Rush, saying he learned early in his career that the culture is set in the corner office. The president gets the credit for the people and the culture of Spalding University. Well, once again, I think I love that you keep the heart of everything you're saying is all going back to the people and the
Mhm.
culture that you've created. So I imagine it makes for a pretty great place to work. And let me use that as an opportunity to kind of turn to, so I'm going to dial you back, maybe not 3 years like the SACS accreditation, but maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago when, there was this inkling of a pandemic coming up when we were starting to figure things out, that it was coming. Tell me a little bit about the challenges your team, the university, what was going on? What were you guys talking about? And how were you thinking about being able to get through the impending storm?
Sure. So, from a financial standpoint, we had struggled for the 2 years prior to that. We'd seen an 8% decline in enrollment year over year, in large part from undergraduate programs. And we thought we had done the things that we needed to do to really see a turn. And we were beginning to see some of that work happen just as COVID was coming on. And so it was sort of a tender time for us to really see this these changes take place and us really begin to yield the dividends of the hard work that we'd been doing. And amazingly enough, since then, COVID was very, very good to us. Those practices really took place. We've offset undergraduate challenges and enrollment with graduate programs very strong,
And
specifically
for
in health
context,
sciences.
for our listeners to have context there, you have tell us the mix of grad
Yeah.
undergrad.
Yeah. So to give you a little bit of background on Spalding, we came out of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth in 1814, so we're over 200 years old. We have about 1,600 students, 45% undergraduate and 55% graduate. Like I said, we'd had some enrollment challenges about 3 years ago, I would say. Just prior to that, we were at a pretty high peak, though. So historically, we're still okay, but we're beginning to grow our way through that. So the strategy that I've really worked out with Tori and our provost, Dr. John Burden, is that we're going to focus on creating 21st century healthcare providers. You don't have to squint too hard to know that Louisville is a healthcare town. I mentioned ResCare that I used to work for, and Humana that's here in town, and also Kindred Healthcare is here in town, and Signature, and a number of other national and even international healthcare companies call Louisville their home. So we know that there's going to be a shortage in supply of nurses, of PTs, of OTs, of respiratory therapists, of lots of different disciplines along that continuum of care. We saw that, you know, in even greater fashion through a pandemic of how do you get vaccine to rural areas,
Yep.
and we're here to make an investment to help solve that problem. Um, if I'm honest, mostly right now we're more of a regional school, but we're looking at taking some of these programs nationally through online platform investments that we've made over the past year and a half, 2 years. So we're excited about that future and looking really to partner with providers on meeting that supply problem that they have, their upstream labor issue right
Yeah.
now.
Yep. So, yeah, and that completely resonates with me. I have friends myself who were deep in the healthcare industry, and the last year and a half really has been very challenging to the point that many of them have left the industry. So I'm
Yep.
seeing that in my personal circle as well, that we have the need is going to continue to be there for quite some
Yep.
time. So I love that the university has this very focused perspective on this. So when I think about the university, building and continuing these relationships with all the different partners in your community, with the students, faculty, and staff, how do you manage all that? So I'm going to turn you a little bit towards technology. So
Mhm.
what a lot of what you said is, well, some of it was grounded in the past, kind of the history of how you got to that point, but really
Right.
looking forward, how are you going to track forward? What technology or technologies are in place or are you planning to put in place to help you keep your eye on how all that's going? And I'm asking that, of course, from a financial angle. I know you touch more than just the finance area, but as the CFO, kind of what are you thinking? How are you going to manage it all?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that because CFOs, I think, are taking more of the chief strategy officers in most other universities. And if you're listening to this podcast and can hear my voice, you already know that the technology is very important, but it's sort of as interesting as the paintbrush is to the artist, right, or the camera is to the photographer.
Yeah,
What we really do is we resource universities so that they can meet their mission in the best way possible.
I
We
love
all
that. Say that one more time.
just that that the role of the CFO is to really resource the university so that other people get to dance in the end zone, right? That you
Love
make them
that.
wildly successful in achieving our mission, and really you should fade to the back. And that's really what technology should sort of do in the hands of the artist. Is really we shouldn't be focusing on particularly the tools, but great tools will get out of the way of conversations. We just hired a new chair of our nursing program, and I was doing my orientation with her, and she was very nervous about our systems versus what she was used to, and what does she need to do to get up to speed. And I said, first of all, let's get a cup of coffee because this is all about conversations. I'm good enough at this job that you can tell me what your goals and dreams are, and we can put that to paper. Numbers are just going to tell that story, and we've resourced this in ways that you're already going to be successful. We've already been conservative. We're not I don't I don't need to make things challenging on top of the challenges that we have as an industry already. And again, if you're in this industry, you know what's ahead, and you know that much in the way that my background was in healthcare, and there were challenges there in terms of people questioning the value of what they were getting. Higher education is in that same space today. People are saying, why would I go broke and take on all this debt to get a college education? And I think the answer and how we pull ourselves through that to a solution is going to be similar in that it's about outcomes. Healthcare outcomes relied on KPIs the same way that we should. Um, as much as when I first came into the higher ed industry, I was just one other guy coming into this thinking that they could change it into a business, but the truth is it is a business, and now we know it more than ever. We're going to see consolidations. We're going to see a lot of struggle and challenge as we stress the system going towards the cliff, the demographic cliff that's going to happen around 2025 or 2026. But
Yeah,
there
it's
are
coming.
ways to do that if you're planning ahead and really being strategic, and also focusing on what your core strength is as an institution, and
Well, I'm going
having
to pause
challenging
you.
conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And a conversation I was just having yesterday was you used the word outcomes, and I want to pick up on that. We
Mhm.
were having this conversation around somebody was asking me the question, well, how are we going to do this thing, whatever we were talking about? And I said, well, no, we got to jump to the end. What is the outcome you were trying to achieve first? Let's make sure we're all crystal clear on that. And we all agree that these are the right things to work toward. Then we can backtrack and say, okay, how are we going to work towards those outcomes?
That's brilliant.
You got to start with
Yes.
the end in mind.
Yeah, exactly. I tell people that a lot of times when they sit down, and you've probably seen this through your career too, Kim, is that they go in and they buy systems and they really don't think what at the end of the day they want. And I tell them, take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and take a pen and put on there what you would like to see and how often. And then you've got a goal that you're shooting towards. Then you know you want to be able to see enrollment broken down by cohort or whatever it is, degrees or those things. And then that's something you can build towards.
Yep.
And
reference later to make sure you're all staying on track.
Yep. To go back to your earlier question, though, so I'm going to jump back just a little bit to our conversation about a year and a half ago when things were really coming online. One of the things that I did first when COVID kind of became a prospect that was imminent is I called our board chair with my president and I said, Spalding is on a June 30 fiscal year end. Typically, we would take the budget for approval to our board, what we say here in Louisville around Derby, so around the first week in May. This was, we were shutting down things. It was March 13th. We'd done a lot of work already. The budget was already coming along nicely. And I called him and I said, you're not going to get a budget. You're not going to get a budget in May. And I'm letting you know that now so that you can prepare. But what I do plan to bring you are options. And so what we did is we used Anaplan to develop what we call an impact model that let us run scenario-based financial models on what might happen. And I took the approach of what we called here internally, the three bears approach. So the mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear, or the best case, the worst case, and the case that we were really presenting as the prospect case to the board.
Yeah.
And that worked really, really well because they began to see how these levers moved and what were drivers and what weren't going to be drivers as we were going into this. And we could look at things like retention rates, and we could look at things like enrollment by program, and we could run those plus and minus. So what we used is that budget that we were already working on was sort of a going concern baseline. So we used that as our best case. We said, best case is COVID doesn't happen. It ends up being nothing. And here's how next year was going to look. And remember, we were coming out, we really hit our inflection point and we're coming into sort of a growth phase. So that those numbers looked okay. They were up just slightly, I would say. Maybe on the gross tuition, it was up maybe 2 or 3%.
Okay.
The worst case for us would be a 15%. So we are small. I'm going to jump back just to give you a little financial profile of Spalding. I told you about 1,600 students. We have about a $25 million endowment. There's not much there to go to in terms of unrestricted funds that we can use for operations. That means we live paycheck to paycheck in terms of tuition. The good news is that Tori and I, while we're not risk averse, we are hawks about being debtors. And so we had more cash than debt, and we had the ability to pay that off if we needed to. So that was a really good place for us to be going into a storm, is knowing that we didn't have to worry about coupon payments to bondholders. We didn't have a mortgage that we had to make. We were very secure in our operational spend. So knowing that, it was really just going to be about how are we going to operate through this next year in terms of enrollment and staffing. Mm-hmm. So those are the real drivers for us. If I had to define in my elevator pitch on what our KPIs would be, it's heads. It's the number of students over the number of employees. Yep. And that's going to be true for most institutions here. I have a rule of 70, which is that if you're like Spalding and you don't have a huge endowment to draw operational funds from, you're going to run about 70% of fully loaded payroll to net tuition. So gross tuition, less any unfunded discounts in your financial aid. That's what you should be running. If you do that, you'll always run surpluses. If you get up in the 80%, that's really the danger zone, and that's where you're probably going to be looking without a great effort in terms of fundraising. You're going to be looking at deficits. So,
well, one of what I like a lot of things you're saying, but particularly what's standing out to me right now is that there are a lot of things that technology and computers can't discern for us,
Mhm.
and it's the thresholds, those KPIs. It's the that you know what your endowment is and how much of it you do or don't have to use towards operations. All of the things that technology can't necessarily discern. So that goes right back to technology is the paintbrush, not the actual painting at the end, right? It's just one
Yep.
of the many things that support us, but you need the human element here to have that um, that lens on what does this all really mean, what are our inputs, what are what where can we flex, that kind of thing. So totally agree
Absolutely.
with what you said earlier. Technology is kind of that underlying thing. um, so you were in this situation where you had this, I like that you have Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear.
Yep.
And I think when we talk about the pandemic, it's something we can all wrap our minds around, because we all lived it, in terms of modeling out different scenarios to figure out what might the outcome be as best as we can discern. But I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit and say,
Yep.
how does that relate to looking forward? So I think we can all get that this is a place where something like a modeling technology like Anaplan can really help. How do you continue to use that? Let's hope and pray that the Delta variant doesn't, give us a tailspin again. Let's say we're past the pandemic. How do you continue to utilize this technology in a way that still gives you the ability to model and work towards certain outcomes?
Yeah.
Might
So,
those scenarios be?
an Anaplan is a great tool in many regards, but one of the aspects is its ability to retain a lot of very detailed information that you can drive scenarios off of. So, what scenarios do? Tori and I use the term guardrails and backstops. So, in being on expeditions, when you're using a map, what you will do is you'll have a point A to point B destination. And as such, you usually find some geographical reference to the east, west, north, south that are guardrails. And you know that if you go past this tree or you go past this mountain, that you're too far east or you're too far west. And then the backstop means that you've gone past where your destination is. So those scenarios really become ways for us to monitor our performance in terms of how are we doing between the guardrails. Are we, to borrow another analogy, are we on the fairway? Are we close to what that baby bear plan was that we said we were going to run with? And that was really, really helpful for us. Now, we also got fortunate. We got, it's they say it's better to be lucky than good, and I think we were hopefully both. Um, because the way the year shook out for us is, you'll remember, the worst case scenario was down 15%. The
Yep.
middle case scenario was, I took the board and said, you need to plan on us being down 10%. Um, and we ended up actually being up at the best case scenario. So we came in
Oh
at right
wow.
about 2 or 3% up in terms of enrollment, which was just fantastic for us. But we managed our costs, and that was very difficult. And I
Yeah.
bragged on the group because culturally doing it was one thing, because we had to make very tough decisions. We had a very small reduction in force. We also all took paid pay reductions. And as you can imagine, we did that progressively, which Anaplan was great at being able to let us create these bands of employees. So if you were under $40,000, we didn't touch your salary at all. If you were $40,000 to $90,000, I think you got a 3% reduction. If you were on the leadership team here, you got a 5% reduction. And my group, me and the provost took a 10% reduction, and the president took a 25% reduction
Wow.
in her compensation. Luckily, because of that enrollment, I say we get 2 paychecks a year. I mentioned that we're on a June 30 fiscal year, but when our fall tuition shows up around September, that's when we get our first paycheck, and that really sets the tone for what the year is going to be. So it was very early on, and I'm very forward focused. I don't know if that comes from my background or just my nature, but I like to think about what's coming down the road. And when we knew that we were not only on the fairway, but we were sitting really pretty in terms of where we wanted to be to goal, I went back to the board and said, we're going to restore all the wages for everyone except for me, the provost, and the president. We're going to also begin to restore, we'd taken a reduction on our retirement plan. So we were able to restore part of that. And that really went a long way to, I think, creating some hope on campus that while we were going to still be having to live through some challenges in terms of working remotely and other things,
Yeah.
people weren't going to have to worry about losing their job, and that financially we were not only going to be okay, but when we did well, we were going to pass that along as fast as we could, and that was
Absolutely.
really important to me,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, this really is about people.
Yep.
Whatever you think your balance sheet it is honestly made up of the time and talent of your employees and your donors.
Yeah. Completely agree. You said something in there about you were talking about being forward focused, and it made my brain think about the opposite in
Mm.
terms of, um, I think for many years, and again, I come from the technology space. That's been my whole career is in higher ed tech. So my brain is always thinking about systems, right?
Yep.
So when we go the reverse, when we think about history, I think we have traditionally done a great job in higher ed tech of building solutions to help people understand what has happened.
Mhm.
And where I think there's still a bit of a gap and in terms of people, institutions utilizing this technology looking forward is the ability to use that base data, that history, that rich analytics, looking back years and years and years to say, what does this mean in terms of moving forward? How can I use this in a way that helps me understand what might be coming and how I might be able to serve my institution differently, whether it's my students, faculty, or staff? I do think there's a gap looking forward. And I want more institutions to leverage the technology and the thought leadership that Spalding has in this area. So when I think about, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we have you share a little bit about what does that mean? Why would you encourage someone to do what Spalding has done, leveraging Anaplan or a similar connected planning solution? What can they do with it? And not just, we've talked about a few use cases, but I know that Spalding does several other things with Anaplan. Like, what are the things you would encourage them to do looking forward with technology, and why?
Okay, you hit it on several really great things, so I'm going to try to capture them all. But if I skip over something, bring me back.
Sure.
One thing I want to hit on is where you mentioned connected systems, because Anaplan is that. I mentioned it has several great features. One of those being scenario based. The other one is, and I think you and I have talked about this, Kim, is that it has the ability to bring information together in ways that are not onerous in any way. You're not going to have to in my past, I had a lot of resources. That was the one good thing about being in healthcare, is that the budget was not the problem. If I needed
Yeah.
engineers, I could hire developers, and we would customize the heck out of a system and be able to do that. Wasn't always quick, and it certainly wasn't cheap, but you could
Yeah.
get it done, and it was a lot of effort. Anaplan doesn't rely on that. It really lets you offload all of the information that's hanging around on your campus that you wanted to get to answer the questions that you get challenged with every day in ways that are seamless. It doesn't tax your IT department. Financial people can actually stack it and start doing analytics on their own, which is really powerful. And then it's inherently built on things that financial and operational people understand: time, money, analysis tools. It's really got a lot of smarts that are already inherently in it, that make it really, really powerful. So that was one thing I wanted to hit on connected. The other one is, I love your comment about looking backwards, because what happens is, we mentioned that the technology gets out of the way. So if you get the right system and it really gives you insights into all these eclectic sources of information together, you begin to see stories, right? Because we know as finance people that numbers are really just telling us stories, the same way that a physician
Yep.
knows what they're seeing when they're looking at an x-ray. We know what those things mean. And sometimes it forces uncomfortable conversations. For example, let's say you've got a program that is um, the dream of an important member of the executive team, but it's been languishing for years.
Hmm.
They say you can tell a person's values by looking at their day timer. I don't know if people use day timers anymore, but their day timer and their checkbook, you can tell what they really care about. Well, it's the same when you're looking at a P&L, right? When you've been talking about growing this program, but it's really just been dying on the vine for 5 years, it's going to force you to have that conversation about, we need to stop saying that. It's not important to us because it's not going anywhere. And we can either pick it up and make it important, or we can focus on the things that we're currently focusing on. That's the important part of having those retrospective look backs about, are we really doing the things that we say we're going to do?
On that important note, are we really doing the things we say we are going to do? I want to thank Russ Sherman from Spalding University for sharing his insights from the perspective of a CFO on the challenges of managing a university through a pandemic and how to put technology to work in the right way to solve those challenges. If you are interested in any of the scenarios that Rush gave as examples, or want to explore scenarios that your institution needs to put past data to work in better predicting your future, please reach out to us at higheredanalytics.com or find me on LinkedIn.